measurements we're going to be needing are our waist circumference, which is 28, our skirt length, which is 26. Skirt is actually a half circle, or what we'll call a 180 degrees flare. To make a 180 degrees flare, what we need to do is we'll take our waist circumference and divide it by 3.14. Now 3.14 is a constant for getting the half circle using your waist circumference. Okay, so we're going to divide our waist circumference by 3.14. So the waist circumference we're using, which is 28, I divided it by 3.14 and I got 8.9. So I approximated it to 9. So we're using 9. This 9 is our radius. We're going to be calling it our radius. And this is what we will need to draft our half circle. So let's get to work. Here I've marked out my circle radius, as you can see here. So I measured from this point here. So different points, I measured 9, which we determined as our radius. So from here 9, from here 9, all around. Then I connected all the points. So this is our radius. From here to this point is my radius. So the next thing I went ahead to do was I imputed my skirt length. So to impute your skirt length, what you need to do is you measure from here, from where this your radius ends, from where the radius of your circle ends, which is here. You measure to wherever your skirt length gets to. So in this case, my skirt length is 26. So I measure 26 from here to downwards. Okay, so I measured it at different points all around, as you can see. 26 all from the end of this radius, 26 all around up to this other point. Okay, so that's my skirt length, and I connected all the points and you can see the shape down. Okay, so I'll have to subtract my waistband. To subtract my waistband, I first have to determine how wide I want my waistband to be. So I want my waistband to be 1.5 inches. So I'm going to be measuring 1.5 from after this radius. So I'll be marking 1.5. So I'll just connect these points. So this is a waistband. So the next thing I will do now is I'll cut out the waistband, then cut out the remaining parts of my skirt. So here I've cut out the skirt, and I also have my waistband. I would place this skirt pattern now on my fabric, and I'm going to cut out the back piece. So if you notice, I'm cutting out only the back piece and the waistband. Because I'm going to be using the same pattern for both the front and the back, I would have to cut out the back first, since the back has no pockets. Then when I'm done cutting out the back, then I'll take out the pattern and then alter it and add pockets to the pattern. So after I add pockets to the pattern, then I'll cut out the front. I hope this makes sense. So I've transferred this pattern to fabric. This is for the back. These are the sides. I have not added any seam allowance, and the reason is that this is crepe, this fabric is crepe, and it has a little bit of stretch. So if I add seam allowance to the side, I'm going to be struggling with excess fabric when I start sewing. So I've decided to use the stretch as my allowance, as my seam allowance. I hope that makes sense. I've also not added any seam allowance to the waist area for the same reason, because of the stretch. It stretches on all sides. So if I add seam allowance to this place, I'm going to be struggling with excess fabric, and the length is going to be excessive. However, when you're drafting your own, if you're using a fabric that doesn't really stretch, let's say you're using African print fabric which does not stretch, please add seam allowance. You can add half of an inch seam allowance or 1 inch seam allowance to the sides. These are the sides, and you can add half of an inch allowance to this waist area. Okay, so for this waist area, the seam allowance you should add is half of an inch, but I'm not going to be adding to mine because I don't want it to overstretch. However, I do have seam allowance on the hemline, so I believe this is going to make up for whatever seam allowance I have not added at the waist, on the waistline here. So notice that I've added seam allowance on the hemline. I have seam allowance added to the hemline here, half of an inch seam allowance. On the sides, however, on the side here, this ends, I have not added any seam allowance. So I started off by not adding seam allowance to this point. Then as I progressed, I gradually added half of an inch seam allowance. Then when I came to this other end as well, I also did not add any seam allowance. Okay, so the reason is when you sew skirts, flay skirts like this, the sides tend to get really longer than the middle. Okay, so it gives it an awkward shape. So this is why I've decided not to add any seam allowance on this side, because by the time I finish joining the side is going to be long. Okay, so when you're working with a stretchy fabric, you want to be mindful of the stretch so that it doesn't distort the shape of what you are trying to, the garment you're trying to make. So that's all. I'm going to take the pattern out, and then I'm going to be adding pockets to this pattern. So I place it on fold so that will save time, so that by the time I finish drafting the pocket on one side, it would be on the other side. I hope it makes sense. So for our pockets, it's going to be on this side, that isn't on fold. So the width of my pockets is going to be 3 inches. So I'll mark 3 inches from here, from this side seam inwards. So I'm going to be marking 3 inches here, and then the depth is going to be 5 inches. So I'll mark 5 inches here. So next thing I'm going to curve is to curve the pocket. So to create the lining or inner part of our pockets, I would need a fresh paper, plain paper. So I'll place it under the skirt pattern, and then I'll arrange it in such a way that this part on fold comes to this edge. Next, I'm going to draw the outline of this waist area. I'm going to trace it out, and also the side. So at this point, I want to determine how deep I would want the pockets to be. So I want the pockets to be 4 inches deep. So I'll mark 4 inches here. As is 4 inches from this point. You can make it as deep or as shallow as you want. Okay, so I'm choosing to make mine 4 inches deep. Continue tracing until I get to that point I have marked. Okay, so this is where my pocket is going to stop. So I'll take out the skirt pattern, and then I'll measure what I have here. This is 9, so I'll just mark 9 around. I'll cut this out. So I'm actually going to be cutting this lining on fold, this pocket lining, that's the inner part of the pocket. I'm going to be cutting it on fold. So I've indicated it here. This is the part that will be on fold, while this is the outer side. I'm going to cut out this pocket shape. So I'll place this inner part of my pocket back underneath this skirt pattern, and then I'm going to trace out this pocket shape on top of that inner part of my pocket. The inner part of the pocket is supposed to be two pieces. Okay, so what I'll have to do is I'll cut out the first inner piece. That I'll place this on fold. I'll place my fabric on fold, cut out the first inner piece. Then when I'm done cutting out the inner piece with this shape, exact shape, then the next thing I'll do is to cut out this shape of my pocket, the shape of this my pocket. I'll cut out this shape of my pocket, and then I'll place it again on another fabric and cut out the second inner piece of my pocket. This is going to make more sense when I start doing it, when you watch me actually transfer it to fabric and actually do this thing I'm explaining. So let's proceed. So now that we are done, I'll just put this pocket piece aside, and then I'll transfer this pattern. Now this is my front skirt pattern. This becomes my front skirt pattern, so I'll transfer this pattern to fabric. Now I've cut the first piece of my pocket lining, and it's the one I use the fabric to cut. I'm going to take out the pattern, and then I'm going to cut the second piece, because before I cut the second piece I would have to cut out this pocket shape. Now I've cut the pockets on fold, so this part is on fold. As I told you, I would cut it earlier. So this part is on fold, but this part is not on fold. So I'm just going to take the pattern out, cut out this shape, and then I'll cut the second piece, which is going to be the lining. So I've cut out the shape. Next thing, I'm going to place my lining, and then I'm going to cut out the second lining for my pocket. So this is the second lining for my pocket, and I've cut it on fold as well. You can see how it looks, and it has the shape of my pockets. I'm also going to transfer the front pattern of my skirt to fabric, as you can see here, and just like I did for the back, I also did not add any seam allowances to the sides and the top. I just added to the lower part. I just did exactly the same thing I did for the front. So transferred my waistband to fabric, and as you can see, I have 4 pieces here. 2 pieces for the front and 2 pieces for the back. I added half of an inch seam allowance around this waistband pattern, and the reason is because I had to interface it. I have hasty on it, and this is to prevent the waistband from stretching, because ideally your waistband is not supposed to stretch, it's supposed to be firm. So I've interfaced it, and for that reason I've added seam allowances around this pattern. Okay, I'm going to be fixing the pockets to the front piece of my skirt, so I'll just take out the pattern. I've taken out the pattern. Now I'm going to place this front skirt pattern in such a way that the right side is going to be facing me. So this is the right side and it's facing me. Next thing I'm going to do is to pick up the lining piece of my pocket. So this is lining piece of my pocket. So I will just bring it up here. This is the waistline of my skirt, and I'll bring it up here and match it up with this upper part of my skirt, and I'm going to pin it down. I'm going to head over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew this part that has the pocket shape, like this curved side. I'm going to sew half of an inch here, and also on the opposite side I'll be sewing half of an inch here. Then I'm going to turn it. So now I've sewn this curved side of my pocket, sewn the 2 sides. I'm going to make tiny cuts on the seam allowance all around this part I have sewn on both sides. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold it like this, and you see this is the lining, this is the fabric, and this is the place where I have joined. So I'm going to hold it like this, and then making sure that this seam allowance part is on the side of the lining. You can see the lining is in a different color, so you can see it clearly. So this side, this seam allowance is going to be on the side of the lining. Then I'm going to top stitch it. I'm going to make a top stitch on the lining side. It looks like the right side of the fabric looks, and the part we have top stitched, and you can also see the wrong side. You can see the seam allowance is on the side of the lining, so that is what you should do as well. So next I'll go ahead and iron this part so that it lays flat. This is what the front of my skirt looks like. This is the pocket side, which I've ironed, and this is the waistline. I'm just going to run a stitch on this waistline just to hold the fabric and the lining together. So I've stitched the waistline, and I've held the lining and the main fabric together in one piece. Next thing I would want to do is to add the second lining of the pocket, which is actually the main fabric. I have here with me the second lining of the pocket, which is the main fabric, and I'm going to be placing it under the skirt, the front piece of the skirt. I'm just going to place it like this. Right now, the right side of the fabric is facing me. So the right side of the fabric should face you. And then you would place the wrong side of the fabric on top of this right side of the lining. This is what I mean. So I'm going to pin them down together. You can see how it looks. You can see the shape of the pocket already, where you can just put your hands in. You can see it's taking shape already. So I'm just going to pin them down together. I've pinned them together, and you can see I've pinned the waist together, the waistline of the front piece of my skirt and the lining I'm trying to attach. I've pinned all of them together, and I've also pinned the sides together just to hold it in place so it doesn't move. So what I'm going to do now is I'll head over to the sewing machine and run a stitch here again just to hold the piece I have now added to the front piece of my skirt so that they now stay together. So I'll just run a stitch here about half of an inch, and then I'll turn my skirt to the wrong side, my skirt piece to the wrong side, and you can see I have my 2 pocket lining pieces here. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is, starting from this end, I'm going to run a stitch just to hold about 0.25 or half of an inch from here down to the other end of the 2 linings. I'm going to be running the stitch just on the 2 linings. That is the lining and the fabric which I'm using as a pocket lining. So I'm going to be running a stitch on both of them from end to end just to hold them in place. So I've run a stitch to hold it in place on the waist and also on the lining as well. I've also held the two linings together. I ran a stitch and I also overlocked the raw edges. So now we have this part left. You can see this part is opened up. So I also want to head over to my sewing machine and run a 1/2 inch stitch as well here on both sides. You can see this part is opened up. So I'm just going to run a stitch to hold all three pieces together. The two linings and then the skirt piece, all of them need to be held together. So I'm going to run a stitch now. This is the front part of my skirt piece. So I'm going to be joining the back and the front together. So now I have the front and the back together here. So I'm going to be joining it on both sides by about 1/2 inch. 1/2 inch on this side and 1/2 inch on the other side. As you may have already noticed, I have interfacing on this side of my skirt piece. I have it on the back piece as well as the front piece, because this is the part where I'm going to be installing my zipper. I do not want it to stretch. I want it to be steady, so I've interfaced it with hasty. I have it on both front and back. So for this side, when sewing or when stitching, I'm not going to reverse stitch at the beginning. So I'm just going to start sewing, sew all the way to where I want my zipper to stop. Then when I get there, I'm going to reverse stitch and I'm going to continue sewing all the way down. So I've placed my skirt piece right side facing right side. This is how you should place it if you want to join. So here I've joined the side seams of my skirts, and as you can see, I've ironed the seams open. I've also gone ahead to overlock the raw edges. I've also finished off the hemline with a rolled hem stitch. If you do not know how to do a rolled hem stitch, I'm going to put a video in the description showing you how you can do it. So I've joined both sides of my skirt piece. I have this side joined. I've ironed the seams open and I have overlocked it. I've also done the same on the other side, the side where I'm going to be having my zipper. So after I ironed the seams open, I went ahead to loosen the stitch all the way to where I'll be having my zipper. You can see it here, it's opened. So here's my waistband piece and I'm going to be pinning them together, 2 each, 2 for the back and 2 for the front. So here I have them pinned together and I'm going to head over to my sewing machine and I'm going to be sewing this top part of my waistband pattern. I'm going to be sewing by 1/2 inch because that is how much allowance I left around my skirt waistband pattern. So I'll sew 1/2 inch here. I'm also going to repeat the same for the other 2 pieces which I'm going to be using for the back. So here I've stitched the top of my waistband, my skirt waistband, as you can see. So the next thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to make tiny cuts around this place. This is because I would have to turn this over to this other side. So I'm going to make tiny cuts so that by the time I turn it, I have to turn it because you know this is a curve. It's going to be relaxed. And now I'm going to be top stitching one side of my waistband. So what I'm going to do is this part where I have sewn, this is my seam allowance, I'll just push it over to one side like this. Then on the part where I have pushed it to, you can see it from the back here, the part where I have pushed the seam allowance to, that is the part I'm going to be top stitching. So I'm going to stitch on top of that place. Can you see? I'll stitch on top of it. I'll do same for both the front piece and the back piece. So now I've top stitched it. The next thing I want to do is I want to join both front and back waistbands together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be joining both of them on the sides here. So I'll just hold them together, making sure that the parts where I have top stitched on both this waistband and the other one match up with each other. So this is the part where I top stitched for this waistband and this is the part where I top stitched for this other waistband. So you can see they are both on the same side. So I'm going to pin them together and then I will sew with 1/2 inch on this side. I've sewn the sides together and this is what it looks like. So now I'm just going to turn it like this. And then I would head over to my ironing table and give it a good press and I'll show you what it looks like. So here I've ironed my waistband and you can see how nice and flat it's laying. So I'm going to be pinning this now to my skirt piece. That's my skirt piece down there. So I'm going to be pinning it together. So I'll pin from this side where I just joined last. This is the part where I did not open. This is the part where the zipper is not going to be. The zipper side is on the other side. and as you can see, I've opened it already, so you know where is the zipper side and the part side is not. So you can see here, notice here that I have joined the sides. Okay, so now this part that is top stitch is will be going to the inside of the skirt. Okay, so what this means is I'm going to be pinning like this. This is the right side of my skirt, by the way. So I'm going to be pinning in such a way that the right side of the waistband will be going to the right side of the skirt. What I mean by right side of the waistband is the part that has no top stitch. The part that has a top stitch is the wrong side of the or the inside of the waistband. Okay, so the outside of the waistband goes to the outside of the skirt. I think that it's better that way. So the outside of the waistband goes to the outside of the skirt, while the inside of the waistband goes to the inside of the skirt, if that makes sense. So I'm going to be pinning outside to outside, outside of waistband to outside of skirt piece. So while pinning, you want to make sure, can you see these seam lines on the side? The seam line on the side of the waistband should match up with the seam line on the side of the skirt. I've pinned both seam lines together, and now I'm going to pin the rest. So I'm going to pin the remaining parts of the waistband to the skirt. I'll pin it this way to the back of the skirt, this back waistband to the back of the skirt, and this front side to the front of the skirt. So yeah, I have it all pinned. I've pinned the waistband to the skirt piece, and the next thing I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to sew on that part. I'll be sewing half of an inch or less. Join the seams of the waistband and that of the skirt together at the waist, as you can see. And next I went ahead to iron the seams in such a way that the seams are now upright, like they are facing inside the waistband. I hope you understand what I'm saying. So I ironed it this way and made sure it was facing up here inside the waistband. Next, also for the other parts of my waistband that is supposed to be inside, I finished off the edges by overlocking it. You can fold it if you want, or you can finish off the edges with a bias. Whatever suits you, it's just fine, but I choose to overlock mine. So now I'm done with that. The next thing I would be doing is I would head over to my sewing machine and install my zipper on the side where I have left for my zipper. I'm going to be doing that off camera, but if you need me to make a video on how I install my zippers, I'll be glad to do it. Just put it in the comment section and say I want to learn how to fix zippers or install zippers, and I'll be sure to make a video about it. So here I've installed my zipper, and you can see what my waistband looks like now after installing my zipper. So next thing I'm going to be doing is I'll need to hold this part of my waistband in place. As you can see, it's opening up and it will not be nice to leave it just like that. So I'm going to be running a stitch inside, in between my waistband and my skirt. Okay, can you see this part? So I'm going to be running a stitch in between here. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that the stitch is inside this place, so that such that it cannot be seen from outside, but you're going to be able to see it on the inside. So while sewing it, you want to be very careful, like sew as slowly as possible, sew very slowly and carefully, so that you don't make a mistake. You do not need to rush, just take your time. What matters is that you have a nicely finished work at the end of the day. So I'll head over to my sewing machine and do just that, and I'll come and show you the outcome. So I've sewn it, and if you look, you will really need to look closely to see the stitch I have made. It's just in between here. So I'm done running the stitch in between my waistband and the skirt, and you really need to look very closely to notice the stitch. But when you turn to the back, you'll see what it looks like. You can see it. So it's holding the waistband to the skirt so that it doesn't open up, and it looks nicely finished. So when sewing this, like I said earlier, you would want to prioritize neatness over speed. So you shouldn't be in a rush. Just calm down and gently sew in between this place so that it looks really neat.